Chapter 22, Asian Transitions in an Age of Global Change. We're going to be looking at the Asian trading network with the coming of the Europeans. We're going to be looking at the Ming Dynasty, and we'll be looking at Japan, its reunification, and fending off the West. Okay, European discoveries. Again, some of this is repetitive. We've seen a little bit of this as the world is starting to get more connected. A lot of the things we're studying in the chapters are going to be a little bit repetitive because they're involved in multiple places, specifically Europe being in a lot of these places as we've looked at the age of exploration and discovery. The next unit will be moving into imperialism. We'll see some more of Europe in a lot of the chapters. European discoveries, products not wanted in the East, nothing new. We've seen this since the Roman Empire. The products not as made as well, not as useful, and so once again, products not needed as much. Muslim traders, when the Portuguese are going to make it over to India, they're going to find out that the Muslims had already been in this area, even Southeast Asia. Now, why that was a shock, I don't know. They were a lot closer than the Europeans were, but the Europeans were very surprised. That's going to obviously hinder some of the conversions to Christianity, as we read. And then Asian political divisions. You had political divisions within the subcontinent of India with Muslims and Hindus in the caste system, and then in Asia dealing with the Mongols, and in Japan having the end of their feudal period with the daimyos, and all of those factors contributing to how the Europeans are able to interact. The Asian trading network, since 1500, you had the Arab zone, Indian zone, Chinese zone. Again, make sure you have an understanding of these zones and what's in there. A couple of years ago, part of this was used on an essay, and I've had previous students say that there's some kind of trading zone question on the multiple choice part of the exam, so make sure that you have an understanding of those. The Arab zone, glass, carpet, tapestries. Indian zone, cotton textiles. Chinese zone, paper, porcelain, silk, and goods. You do have some marginal regions, Japan, Southeast Asia, East Africa. Those are raw materials, ivory, and spices. All right, the trading empire, the Portuguese responses to the encounter at Calicut. Portuguese used military force. They had to use military force because their goods weren't as sufficient, so the Indian merchants didn't want to trade with them. And then they only had so much bullion with them to trade. They didn't want to give it all up. And on top of that, they still needed some of it to get back for paying taxes and other items they might need to trade for food and goods to make it back up to Europe. They also didn't want to return to Europe without anything. If they returned, they would be disgraced. They may not even be believed if they actually made it to India, only because this would have been several trips they've tried. They finally made it. They were going to need an abundance of spices and goods in order to show that, and so they used military force. Now, noting this, the Egyptians and the Indian merchants are going to form a fleet to go against the Portuguese, and in Diu in 1509, and the Portuguese are going to defeat the Egyptian and Indian fleet. This will prove to be dominant for the Portuguese, and they will control trade between India and the east coast of Africa. Forts for defense, they had Ormuz in 1507, Goa in 1510, and Malacca. The goal was to monopolize the spice trade and control all shipping. Now, as we've seen, this turns out to be one of their downfalls, trying to control all of it. Also, controlling shipping also proves to be a downfall because the Asian trading network had already been in existence for a long period of time. For centuries, they had ways about doing their business, and then all of a sudden, these big Europeans are going to come in and say, do it our way. That doesn't go over so well. Here's a picture of the Goa market. Just two things to note. The European women and some of the Indian women having crosses on there. Now, you don't have a widespread conversion in India as we've studied, but Goa was a pretty busy market, almost like an international city, more or less. Portuguese vulnerability and the rise of the Dutch and the English trading empire. 17th century, English and Dutch challenged the Portuguese control. The Portuguese had spread themselves too thin, as I just mentioned, trying to monopolize the area. Portugal didn't have a large population to begin with, and then bringing a large amount of people over to control the spice trade, because it was in such a vast region, they were spread out. And so they were spread too thin. They didn't have the military force that they needed. They didn't have the manpower. And eventually people would become corrupt. Some of the merchants would just go out independently and make wealth for themselves. And so the Portuguese were having a lot of problems. So the Dutch come in 1620, they take Malacca, they build the fort at Batavia in 1620. This is important because it's on the other side of the island, and it's where the spices were actually being grown. So then they can be harvested and put on the boats right then and there, versus having to go across the island. Now I know it's an island, but still, it's another process, and this just showed how more systematic the Dutch were in their organization. They would also even go, excuse me, would even go to the extent of transplanting the spices. So if there was an area too far away or an island where it would be too difficult to control, they would take the spices and just transplant it somewhere else and grow it on an island they were already having control in. They also concentrated on certain spices, so they weren't trying to have a monopoly on all of the spices. They were focusing on just few that were valuable and of use in Europe, and so that was their major focus, unlike the Portuguese. General use force a whole lot less than the Portuguese. Now there were some few incidences like in Sri Lanka for the cinnamon trade and some places like that where they're going to use force, but less force than the Portuguese had to use. The English will end up getting India. Hindsight 2020 turns out to be a better deal, but at that moment when the Dutch took Malaysia and Indonesia and the English took India, it looked like the Dutch got the better end of the deal. They're going to be prospering originally a lot better, but as the spice trade starts to decline a little bit, we'll see the textile and other spices from India start to rise, and the British will end up becoming a lot stronger. Alright, going ashore, European tribute system in Asia. Europeans restricted to coastlines, permission needed to trade inland. Very similar to Africa. Very few places they went actually all the way inland. You had Angola to a degree and the Congo with the Christian missionaries. But for the most part, all of those ports along the coast. Same thing over in Asia. Sporadic conflict, I just mentioned the Sri Lanka part. Missionaries. I just mentioned Christian missionaries in Congo. The only other place in Southeast Asia where they're going to be successful is in the Philippines, and that's going to be the northern Philippines. And really the only reason they're successful is because you already didn't have another major religion there. Buddhism, Hinduism, or Islam had not made it to that region, and therefore you had your native religions. The people were a little more receptive to it. There wasn't as much outside influence in that area, so the Europeans were the first outside influence, and Christianity will stick a lot better there. There'll be some glimpses, some moments in India, very close to major conversions in Japan, but again, those are all going to fall short. Spreading the faith, the missionary enterprise in South and Southeast Asia. Again, I don't know Italian, so we're going to go with Robert, the Italian Jesuit. In 1660s, conversion of upper caste Indians. This is a different approach than the rest of the Catholicism or the Catholic missionaries have been taking. Your Portuguese and your Spanish in this region. He decides to adapt more to their culture. He learns multiple languages, the different dialects, and he also learns Sanskrit so he can read and write the ancient text of Hindu. And he even takes his Western clothes off and wears the clothes of your upper castes. He's actually somewhat successful to a degree. Two things are going to halt him. One, he cannot get the castes to unite in Christianity. They still want the caste system, and so you can't get your conversions between your lower castes and your upper castes to unite with each other. That was one difficulty that was halting major conversions. And the other was the other Catholic missionaries. They didn't agree with his methods. And again, hindsight 2020, now you see missionaries going for training, learning languages before they even go over to the areas they're going to serve. But the missionaries pretty much were not happy with that, so they kind of tattle on him. They tell the Pope. Pope was like, I don't know about this, and so he pulls him back, and that kind of ends up halting the conversions you have in India. Excuse me. And again, make sure you're looking at the maps. You're having an understanding of where areas are. This map also lists major port cities that you're going to have and who is controlling those port cities. Okay, moving on to the Ming Dynasty, 1368 to 1644, founded by Zhu Wanzong. It's important to note that he was a peasant who rises up. This is similar to the beginning of the Han Dynasty, which we're going to see some major similarities as far as comparisons go. Helps expel the Mongols, takes the name Hongwu in 1368, and the Mongols were forced north of the Great Wall. Now, he was a peasant, so he wasn't well educated as far as reading and writing goes, but he was a great military leader, and he was a great observer of history and understanding what allowed an empire to rise and what allowed an empire to fall. So he brings in a lot of major reforms to help establish the empire. Only if later rulers would have kept up with these, who knows how strong the Ming would have been. Another scholar gentry revival. Again, that's the focus of these major empires as they rise, focusing on the scholar gentry. What needs to be brought back, what needs to be improved, what needs to be getting rid of. Restoration of the scholar gentry had high offices, imperial schools restored, civil service exam reestablished. To help keep the scholar gentry in check, there were several things put in place. One of those was beatings, floggings, and death for ineptitude, for cheating, and for corruption. And so that would help with a lot of things that led to some decline in other empires. He also got rid of the chief minister, who in a lot of other empires would have been challenging the rule, or in some cases was really ruling, and the emperor was more like a puppet than anything else. And so he eliminates that position, and he takes all of those powers himself. Another important thing is he saw the rivals between your aristocrat royal families trying to marry for more power and more land. And so he eliminates that by saying imperial wives must be from modest families. And so that's an important act as well to help keep the strength of the empire. A return to the scholar gentry's social dominance. With this, he's going to bring about agricultural reforms. With irrigation, he's going to build dikes to help with flooding, which would destroy a lot of the rice fields. They improved peasant lives. They tried to balance some of the land reforms and give peasants more land. That was one of the questions on the quiz. You saw the economy and social order. Still power rested in the amount of land, not wealth. That's why merchants were still a little bit lower. Women confined and bearing male children was stressed. You still had a strong Neo-Confucian presence here with the Confucian thoughts with the scholar gentry. An age of growth, agriculture, population, commerce, and the arts, all of that prospering and flourishing under the Ming Dynasty, especially at the beginning. Even showing the world network being connected here. You have corn, making it from the Americas over to Asia. This is important because corn is a grain, and it allows for a good harvest when you're struggling with a drought. And so corn doesn't need as many nutrients as rice, and it doesn't need as much water as rice. Now it does need nutrients, it does need water, but it doesn't need it to the rich land that rice does, and so therefore it can be grown in not as well conditions as rice, and also in other parts of the land in the country, and so that helped as a staple in their diet. Chinese manufactured goods were in high demand, especially with the Europeans, and so merchants are going to gain a large profit during this time period, but two things still holding them back: the Confucian ideas and the scholar gentry having a heavy tax on them, and again, still the culture was land equaled power, not wealth. Patronage of the fine arts. Again, arts still being a major influence within the Chinese dynasties. You're going to see paintings now, and everything isn't just ink work. You'll see a lot of paintings now. Innovations in literature, woodblock printing, so moving in their printing press methods as well. An age of expansion. I'm not going to go in depth in this. We've covered it. This is the third chapter in a row we're seeing this in. So if you have any questions, please come and ask. Missionaries. You're going to have the Jesuits try to convert the elite. So they're going to be moving into the courts at Beijing. Mateo and Adam are your two major ones. And they don't find much success in conversions. There is some curiosity and some interest in some of the technology and the fact that these big, white, hairy barbarians can actually be intelligent. They do offend the Chinese a little bit in correcting their calendars. There's a little offense there. Originally, when the clock was introduced and the watches, they thought they were toys. So there was some hesitation there by the Chinese, but also some curiosity with how intelligent they are. And eventually, we'll end up seeing only 2 port cities open up to the Europeans. China's still taking that isolationist view. So that can prove to be, there's a lot of positives and negatives there. Probably more positives during this time period with the way the Europeans will move into imperialism. All right, Ming Decline and the Chinese predicament. All right, you're going to end up with weak rulers. Once again, reforms that have been put in place start to be ignored or abolished. Weak rulers come in to rule and are more focused on themselves and their luxuries. So public works decline, which leads to failures, which leads to starvation and rebellion, which leads to landlords exploiting the peasantry, which leads to the dynasty overthrowing in 1644 by the Qing. Once again, this is your dynastic cycle, and you have your justification there. Following the Qing dynasty will be the Manchu Churchans. As your book noted, these are not Mongols, so make sure you understand that. You could see some kind of question on the AP exam about that. Don't get them confused with the Mongols. Okay, moving on to Japan. Fending off the West, Japan's reunification in the first challenge. Three major leaders are going to lead in reunifying Japan and bringing them out of that daimyo state that they had been in. Nobunaga will be your first one, and he's going to use firearms, and he moves the Shakuga shogun in 1573. He was a strong ruler and had a lot of great reforms, but he's going to be killed in 1582. His general steps into place. There was a little worry that things weren't going to continue when you see a strong leader go out, but the general decides to take his footsteps even further. And in 1590, he will have ruling Japan. The only mistake he makes is he tries to continue to attack Korea and expand, and that turns out to be a failure. So there was some succession struggles after 1598, but Tokugawa Ieyasu is going to come to power, and he emerges victorious. And in 1603, he's appointed the shogun, and he will be controlling Japan and finally reuniting it. You'll have Edo or Tokyo, was the direct rule of the Honshu, which you have the full restoration. The Tokugawas will last until 250 years, so until the 20th century. So again, slowly starting to creep in with some more modern time periods here. All right, dealing with the European challenge, traders, missionaries to Japan since 1543. The Japanese very interested in the firearms. That's what helps them reunify the state. They like the idea of the clock. Presents for Japanese silver and copper and finished goods. So the Europeans finally catching on to their goods not being as well valued, and so the Europeans were trading things from Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Southeast Asia, trading those items to Japan, and that proved to be wealthy as well. Nobunaga is going to protect the Jesuit missionaries that come to this area for a couple reasons. One, it was intriguing. Two, the Buddhist influence was still very strong. There was some negativity towards the Buddhists for the fact that they helped get them into that feudal position and into that daimyo's warring state position. And so the Christian alternative was better. There was a lot of conversions occurring, and so it was seen as a better outlet. However, Hideyoshi is less tolerant for a couple reasons. One, the Buddhists were starting to become weak, so there was no need for major conversions. And also the Japanese were very hesitant towards the Europeans and their control because they've seen what other areas they've taken over, and they don't want that to happen to themselves. And so they're going to limit them to one port in Japan. So you have Japan's self-imposed isolation. Foreign influence was restricted from the 1580s onward. We will see again later on with imperialism the interaction between Japan and specifically the British. Christianity, persecutions by the 1590s, and it was banned by 1614. Again, this was to remove the Europeans out of that. There had been a lot of conversions, but again, this was another falling short for the conversions of Christianity. And so you still just have the northern Philippines as a success. Merchants were also restricted in 1616. By 1630, Japanese ships forbidden to sail overseas. By the 1640s, the Dutch, Chinese visit only as Demishi Islands, and so they were allowing the Dutch to trade with them, but again, very limited. Complete isolation from the mid-1660s onward. The Tokugawa will have a Neo-Confucian revival. It's replaced by the National Learning School, though, so you are going to see a little bit of a difference from China. And here is another map that you want to make sure you have an understanding of. And that concludes Chapter 22.